Believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see. Hello everyone, and welcome to None of What You Hear, a show about the darker stories of pop culture, legend, and lore. We have a VIP lineup of notoriety at the door for today's show, and a Sunset Strip mainstay that has been the site of some of the most legendary and anguished events. Heading past the velvet ropes, I just want to gently mention today there will be discussion of drug and alcohol abuse, overdose, and a very brief mention of child sexual abuse. We'll also be talking about mobsters, movie stars, music icons, Hollywood, and the Holly Weird. And a rock and roll venue so iconic the mere mention of its name conjures up images of some of the most decadent and debaucherous Hollywood rock shows, parties, and tragic misadventures. Because even the most ubiquitous megastars should have a place to let their hair down, cut loose, and be themselves. But too much of a good thing can sometimes have regrettable and even deadly consequences. You find yourself in the familiar setting of a loud, smoky rock club. Suddenly you're hit with an all-too-familiar but nevertheless terrifying feeling. Your heart is pounding, racing, and all the blood rushes to your numb face. That last bump hit much harder than it should have. But after days on a steaming freight train of self-abuse, this shoe was bound to drop sooner or later. As the throbbing club scene tunnels down to a pinpoint, you drop to the floor. The next things you remember are spotty. A close friend is rifling through your pockets. He was just on stage, but his festive vibe mere moments ago has shifted to loosely controlled panic. And the club, loud and vibrant while you were standing, is silent with all huddled eyes on you. Your friend is still prodding at your pockets like a TSA guard on high-speed scrubbing mode. "You got anything? You got anything on you?" the pop star repeats. You're unable to answer in your disorientation. It wouldn't be cool if anything was found on you by the medics. With your pockets turned out clean, the EMTs arrive and load you onto a stretcher. As you're wheeled out to fresh air, you see the numbers 8852 on the walls of the matte black building you were just inside, and little else. As you're loaded onto the ambulance, your blurry gaze pans down to the sidewalk. Even in your confusion, one thing becomes crystal clear. You're lucky to be leaving here with your life. The viperroom has not always extended this courtesy. The establishment we now know as the viperroom once started out as a humble grocery in the area joining Hollywood and Beverly Hills known as the Sunset Strip. But that was long before we ever associated those neighborhoods of Los Angeles with fame, riches, and glamour. From 1921 through the Great Depression, then World War II, Young's Market provided the essential staples to blue-collar workers and film industry personnel of low and high stature alike. But in 1947, an infamous gangster had other plans for the location. Mickey Cohen had cut his teeth with the notorious Chicago crime kingpin Al Capone. With his merit, Cohen was eventually sent out west to set up shop in Los Angeles and assist in organized crime operations on the West Coast. He'd be under the direction of Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, who invented the concept of what we now know to be Las Vegas. A mecca for legalized gambling the mafia would be able to skim millions from for years to come. Siegel was murdered by the mob when it was discovered his girlfriend Virginia Hill had been skimming or helping Bugsy to skim millions from the Flamingo Hotel and Casino he'd founded. With Bugsy out of commission, Mickey Cohen effectively became the boss and organizer of West Coast crime operations. In addition to his fortified home and a few backroom and basement offices, Mickey ran business through a small Sunset Boulevard jazz club he renamed from Young's Grocery to the Cotton Club after the famous Harlem venue when he took it over and revamped its function and clientele. When a mob deal that went bad rendered the interior of the club gutted by flames, Mickey Cohen remodeled and rebuilt the nightspot again to be a club for exotic dancing called Last Call. When an ordinance banning lewd dancing was passed after a few years of Bada Bing-style mob activity, the club was boarded up. Mickey Cohen was indicted on tax evasion charges the next day and eventually sentenced to Alcatraz, where he would share the walls his one-time boss Al Capone had once inhabited. After Cohen's abrupt departure from the club, it changed hands of ownership and brand a few times in the coming years. Through the 50s and 60s, what was fated to become the Viper Room became a club called the Melody Lounge. Through the 70s, it was a dive bar by the name of Filthy McNasty's, which, sadly, in spite of the promise of its name, this iteration yields no incidents of infamy or notable mention. In the early 80s, the venue again became a jazz lounge where Ricky Lee Jones and John Belushi could often be spotted enjoying a beverage and some bebop standards. The Central was a live music venue that held jam performances by semi-retired 60s rockers, including members of The Who and the Jimi Hendrix Experience throughout the 80s. The jazz club turned strip club turned series of mediocre dive bars only to end up jazz club would end up again changing hands when the Central found itself in hopeless financial decline in the early 90s. Arnold Schwarzenegger eventually lost the bidding war for the Central to another group interested in the club. That partnership included a fellow prominent Hollywood personality at the time that had starred in such iconic films as A Nightmare on Elm Street, Edward Scissorhands, and Oliver Stone's Platoon. A musician turned actor born in Kentucky by the name of Johnny Depp. Johnny's idea for the club was quite different than what had been attempted previously. Johnny worked with Tom Waits, among others, on the vision of a clubhouse of sorts where his fellow stars and pop personalities could come, hang out, grab a beer, and watch a rock show without fear of being mobbed by fans or hounded by the paparazzi. Owing to Depp's colossal career success, the lack of necessity for the club to turn a profit left the door open to be as creative with the management and vision of the club as the talented group of artists and musicians that would hang within its walls. Johnny himself often sat near the door or monitoring a security camera in order to cherry-pick and curate who would be admitted to the club by relaying his choices to the door staff via earpiece. It would be a venue for big names to play small shows, often with secret exclusive performances by the likes of Iggy Pop, Pearl Jam, and the Red Hot Chili Peppers. The club would debut Johnny Cash's legendary stripped-down American Recordings era style he worked with Rick Rubin to develop. It would also host celebrity rock and roll supergroups consisting of members like Slash, Juliette Lewis, Keanu Reeves, Jared Leto, and Johnny Depp himself. It would serve as a filming location for such iconic pictures as Valley Girl, Entourage, Charlie's Angels, and The Doors. For a time, it would host an endless hang to a list of pop culture legends so long to mention, I might do just as well to name who was not spotted there in the mid to late 90s. As such a list of who's who's would hardly rival those who were. The soon-to-be world-renowned nightclub and rock and roll venue would be called the Viper Room. Only a few short months after its opening in 1993, the Viper Room would forever be branded with a tragedy it is still synonymous with to this day. River Jude Phoenix was born in Oregon in August of 1970. He was named after the River of Life referred to in the book Siddhartha about the origins of Buddhism. A few years after River's birth, his family moves to Venezuela to join community living with a notorious cult called the Children of God, who was based in the South American country at the time. Founder of the cult, David Berg, had some pretty twisted beliefs on many things, the most nefarious of which was his views on the kinds of relationships that would be appropriate between adults and children. Abhorrently, he preached that the love between an adult and a child should be no different than that between two adults on every level. Unfortunately, River was not spared from the perversion, and he later reported to the press he was raped at the age of 4. And in another interview stated that the Children of God were disgusting and ruining people's lives. His brother Joaquin has since rebuffed the claim, stating that River was simply trolling a hounding press River despised, and just messing with them as his own undercover prank. The truth is unclear. Suffice to say, being raised in a notorious child sex cult is rough business, and neither River nor Joaquin much enjoyed discussing it ever. Children of God still operates today under the moniker The Family International, as the latest of several rebranding efforts to disguise themselves from their dark reputation and avoid litigation. River's parents said they eventually became disillusioned with the organization they referred to as the Church, and they in time returned to the U.S., settling in Los Angeles. River began to explore acting at a young age and began auditioning. His persistence resulted in landing work in commercials for Mitsubishi, Ocean Spray, and Saks Fifth Avenue. As his career begins to grow, River begins to get film work in such productions as The Explorers and his seminal role in a film called Stand By Me, adapted from a Stephen King short story. With the continued successes of the films, the hottest scripts kept making their way to him, and he was consistently chosen for high-profile film roles through the 80s and early 90s, including Gus Van Sant's My Own Private Idaho and Spielberg's Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade. He's still celebrated as one of the best actors of his time. And by the time Johnny Depp was getting things together for the Viper Room, River was at the top of the Hollywood A-list. But as one of those rare birds like Kurt Cobain, he never let fame get to his head. In fact, he generally shied away from the off-screen spotlight. He also remained very active with his musical pursuits, and way ahead of his time became something of an environmental activist. Unfortunately, he also began to dabble heavily in drugs, eventually succumbing to the impossibility of recreational heroin use, and by the early 90s he had developed quite the habit. By early summer of 1993, River experiences a full-on drug overdose. However, it seems filming keeps him out of trouble, and he managed to stay clean and healthy while he was filming what was to be his last picture, Dark Blood, in Utah and New Mexico. But after 2 months, almost instantly upon his return to Hollywood, he was on a massive binge, according to accounts from friends. October 31st, 1993 would find River in the darkest of states. His sister Rain and brother Leaf, who would later change his name to Joaquin, were visiting and had the itch to go out on the town and enjoy the Hollywood Halloween scene. River was initially reluctant to join the festivities as he was trying to straighten himself out for some work-related things coming up the next day. At the very last minute, River got the bug to join the crew and kick things off at the Viper. River's girlfriend at the time, Samantha Mathis, was trepidatious about him exposing himself to the elements, as it were, but Johnny Depp's band P was playing with Flea sitting in, and River had a standing invitation to join them with his guitar if he had the urge. Or so was his justification to Mathis, so she decided to tag along and hopefully keep River grounded. A night of sibling frolic, music, and friends could be just what the doctor ordered to get him back out of his slump. Now, as I'm learning, at times like these, accounts are as diverse as the people telling them, but shuffling a few credible accounts together has things playing out about like this here. The group, including River, Rain, Joaquin, and Mathis, find themselves at the Viper just as the headliners P make it to the stage and start warming up. River happens to mention to someone that he's feeling off, and the acquaintance hands him a tumbler and replies, "Drink this, you'll feel great," or something to that effect. River downs the entire drink and almost immediately falls to the floor in fits of convulsion. Somehow the four make it outside, where the apparent seizure continues. Joaquin makes his infamous heart-wrenching 911 call as Rain and Mathis try to do whatever they can to get River to stop shaking and keep breathing. The band has now stopped, and the party is in a state of bewilderment, abuzz, trying to figure out what's going on. Flea drops his bass and rushes out the door to find that his dear friend River is lying on the sidewalk just outside the door of the Viper, scarcely moving or breathing, while the other three are wailing in confused shock, pleading for someone to help and waiting to wake from the bad dream. They'd been at the Viper Room for less than half an hour. The ambulance arrives and Flea hops in to accompany his comatose friend, but all efforts were effectively too late and River was pronounced dead shortly after arriving at Cedars-Sinai. Toxicology would later find the culprit to be a mixture of cocaine and heroin, which was bolstered by a later account that River drank a speedball. The Viper Room and the tragic Halloween overdose of River Phoenix would forever remain chained to each other in a macabre bond. In spite of the untimely tragedy, the Viper Room would still see its heyday as a 1990s celebrity hang and hub of all things grunge-era LA cool that Depp had conjured. Having recently broken up with his Edward Scissorhands co-star Winona Ryder, Depp was now dating It Girl and heroin chic poster child Kate Moss. An all-time bash was planned for her 21st birthday. I mean, it was a big deal. She was finally going to be able to drink alcohol. A cornucopia of A-listers and Hollywood cool kids were slated to attend. Michael Hutchins of INXS fame and Life Excess notoriety suggested to Depp that he invite fellow Aussie pop star Jason Donovan to join the festivities. Donovan attempted to hide his giddiness over the invite from the king of 90s cool, Johnny Depp himself, but was low-key doing his happy dance for weeks in anticipation. He was just completing work on a film and was exhausted from the run, but the idea of missing such an exclusive get-together was a non-starter. Foregoing sleep in lieu of more time to find drugs, he raced to the airport to catch the 14-hour flight. Upon arrival to his LA hotel room on Sunset, he waives calling room service for a meal and instead orders up a knapsack of weed and half an ounce of uncut cocaine, which he then spends all night and the bulk of the next day nose deep in pre-funking alone in his room. By the time he was set to head just down the street to the Viper for the party, he had still eaten little, if anything, and still not slept since he woke for the workday wrapping up the film in Australia. But never mind all that. He felt great. He felt great. He felt great. And even in his amped up state, he knew that he had already imbibed to excess and left his drugs behind at the hotel. He also knew Johnny and the club were under considerable LAPD scrutiny after the River Phoenix OD. Besides, as he was so close to the hotel, he could always run up for a bump if need be. He states in an article for The Mirror that he then proceeded to run, quote, back and forth like a crazed dog, desperate not to miss the party yet hungry for my next fix. By the time the slamming party had reached a call-and-response fever pitch with Johnny and Michael Hutchins' rendition of Gloria by Van Morrison, Jason says he realized he was, quote, about to go, stating, I knew the symptoms all too well, for it was not the first time it had happened to me. My heart was racing, my vision was blurring, and I was becoming disoriented. I tried to steady myself, but my legs buckled under me and I fell to the floor. Suddenly, as I illustrated at the top, the teeming crowd had fallen silent and all eyes were huddled around him. I don't know if any of you have ever had that misfortune of such an experience, whether it be rock and roll, near overdose, or a stray softball, but it is indeed the most surreal of feelings to have everyone looking down at you very oddly like that. Anyway, Donovan then fades out again, and the next thing he remembers is Michael Hutchins rifling through his pockets looking for stray blow, before he blacks out again, carrying only a snapshot of a memory of being wheeled out of the club. He's observed for a time at Cedars-Sinai. Talk about a place we all wish the walls could talk, am I right? After spending about 3 hours in the hospital, he discharges himself and heads right back to the hotel. Knowing the 21 Run after party was also being held in the same place he was staying, he makes his way to Depp's door where he's greeted by the rock star of the silver screen himself, who graciously accepts Jason Donovan's timid apology and advises this by Donovan's recollection. That's cool, don't worry. We were just pleased you are okay. Now take some advice from me, go to your room, get some sleep, and for God's sake, take it easy in the future. Donovan says, I headed back to my room, tail between my legs. I had made an utter fool of myself. I tried to party with the big boys, tried to be so very rock and roll, but all I'd done is made a complete idiot out of myself. I went over to my drawer by my bedside table, pulled out my coke stash, and without a second thought, cut myself a line. Oh, you thought he was going to say flush the whole thing, huh? Those of you who know a little something about addiction knew it was a coin flip there. Jason Donovan was not invited to join the after party in the neighboring room or to any future festivities. And Michael Hutchins would end up playing his very last live song ever at the Viper Room with his rendition of Bowie's Suffocate City before his own death by misadventure just a short while later. There was someone else who was invited to the Viper Room that night, however, who was invited back again and again, eventually on a scheduled basis. Adam Duretz of the Counting Crows was a celebrity bartender for the Kate Moss party on the heels of his most successful time as a musician and kept regular bartending shifts at the Viper in an effort to keep it real in the face of fame. Also around this time of Viper Room glory, another landmark residency began. The Pussycat Dolls, who had been invented in Christina Applegate's garage, did an audition for Johnny, to which he reportedly received with elation, stating, innovations like the Pussycat Dolls are the reason he opened up the Viper Room. The Pussycat Dolls did a long stint of weekly residency at the club before outgrowing it, and eventually entertaining the world with their particular brand of rock and roll burlesque. A considerably less public-facing regularity was also making a name for itself in the form of a quite literally underground high-stakes celebrity poker game, hosted by a former Olympic hopeful by the name of Molly Bloom in the Viper Room basement bar. The likes of Leonardo DiCaprio, Ben Affleck, and Alex Rodriguez And a real gem of a neighborhood Spider-Man, Tobey Maguire, who was by all accounts a bit of a character when it came to his role within the clandestine clique and his treatment of Molly. The undercover gamblers would toss around disposable $10,000 buy-ins and test their luck against all manner of Los Angeles big shots, from real estate developers to film moguls and twins named Olsen. Molly eventually moved the game to the bungalows at the Beverly Hilton, among other high-profile locations. The bungalows at the Beverly Hilton. Talk about another place for wishes of talking walls, am I right? I actually just recently picked up the book Molly's Game, so we will be getting much deeper into those hijinks in the near to mid-future. And on the subject of hijinks, no account of a legendary rock club of any kind would be complete without tales of drug and alcohol-marinated train wreck on-stage performances. And considering how LA was steeped in a thick stew of heroin during this time, there are no shortage of those. However, one artist seemed to hold the crown for particularly horrendous 1990s viperroom showings, and that was Red Hot Chili Peppers guitarist John Frusciante. He got up for one song on the fateful '93 Halloween open stage, but promptly threw up and decided it was not his night to shine. It was a cursed one, as we've discussed. Then quite a bit later in '97, he played a spectacular disaster of a set that can be found on YouTube in all its stutter-start, ball-dropping, marble-mouth crooning glory. He began by verbally scolding the soundman for not properly amplifying his acoustic guitar, while simultaneously blaming himself for Rivers' death by not playing well on the fateful night, to the awkward bewilderment of the audience. The typically remarkably innovative guitar legend then proceeded to put on a bizarre, erratic performance that would have been put to shame by any run-of-the-mill curbside busker playing for pocket change and stray nugs of bud. I think I've painted the picture for you, and I'm not here to rubberneck someone's lifelong shame resulting from the depths of their addiction they themselves probably have no hope of remembering, save the fact it lives in infamy within a couple clicks and keystrokes. But this is one of those rare occasions where I am able to report the nosediving rocker was able to get his deteriorating body and mind together and end up back with one of rock and roll's most long-standing consistent successes. John Frusciante remains sober, active, and innovative, having released yet another shining example of the unique sun-soaked funk the Red Hot Chili Peppers beam with just last month. There is just one more Viper vignette to display, and this one involves a bizarre controversy related directly to Johnny Depp himself, and we'll get into it when we come back. Do you remember way back when I mentioned it wasn't Johnny alone, but a group of partners who ended up outbidding Arnold to buy the Central and make it the Viper? Side note, can we even venture what kind of monstrosity would have been forced upon the Sunset Strip by that particular Planet Hollywood founder? That would have been a tuma. Sorry, couldn't resist. At any rate, Johnny bought the club with some partners that included a man by the name of Anthony Fox. Anthony Fox was last seen by any verifiable measures in Ventura County in 2001. His truck and .38 caliber revolver went missing with him, but the truck was found abandoned a few weeks after he was last seen. He left a teenage daughter behind. Shortly after the day of his disappearance, he was scheduled to testify against Johnny in court. Fox had brought suit against Depp, alleging Depp had defrauded him out of millions in Viper Room revenue and covered it with shady accounting. But when Fox disappeared close to when he was set to testify, the only logical conclusion was that Depp had temporarily been possessed by the ghost of Mickey Cohen and had the Fox situation settled permanently via means of foul play. It was rumored that not only had Depp had Fox whacked, but that he was buried in the Viper Room basement. Obviously. However, actual logic points to a much less dramatic unfolding of Fox's disappearance. It may or may not surprise you that the entire reason Fox had brought suit to begin with was that he was already in a state of financial peril, and he saw the writing on the wall of the case being dismissed for lack of substance. We've already talked about how the Viper Room didn't make any money at the time, nor was it intended to, much less millions in revenue. Fox is said to have potential resources back where he was from in the UK, and that with a substantial inheritance coupled with selling off of some of his deceased mother's antiques, he was able to squirrel away a nest egg that would enable him to live off-grid indefinitely, where some suspect he remains to this day. Upon Johnny Depp's ultimate departure from the Viper Room, he gave any remaining shares of the club he owned to Fox's daughter, which could either be read as Johnny being a kind and generous human person who knew the girl was having a rough go with her father, Johnny Depp's former partner, having evaporated, or as a gross admission of a guilty, murdering, and basement-burying conscience. It was also alleged by Anthony Fox's ex-wife that she actually spotted him at a Barnes & Noble some years after the disappearance. She claims that when she recognized and approached him, he ran like a bat out of hell. Which I personally am not entirely inclined to believe, however, because we all know bats can't run. Fox had also established a record of pulling a disappearing act before, though I couldn't find any specific accounts of that aside from the statement itself, and it seemed vaguely pertinent. But, having told you all that, there are still some who say the ghost of Anthony Fox can be encountered in the Viper Room basement during the wee hours of late-night bar cleanup. In fact, it's a pretty well-established piece of the Viper Room lore that the joint is haunted. According to a GM, there is said to be a cold spot near the end of the bar where people have been known to have their knees buckle or just full-on pass out. I'm not sure if that's specifically where River slammed the Liquid Death, or where Jason Donovan, by his own quoted recollection, had his legs fall out from under him. But if there are ghosts, there could be a number of reasons for the cold spot, considering the club's long macabre history. A former manager has reported getting a regular phone call wherein the caller only states, "Hi, it's me," followed by static and an eventual hang-up. He does not describe the calls as a prank. Another longtime employee tells stories of a texting ghost. The bartender will speak aloud to the ghost and get responses via text from a dead number. She also recounted that the text ghost has expressed her displeasure and confusion at not being able to be seen. And finally, a former employee by the name of Macy Jane has confirmed that she was personally told there is indeed a body buried in a room with a dirt floor behind the downstairs lounge. But no matter what actual or metaphorical ghosts are confined within the walls and outside on the sidewalk of the Viper Room, the club's days are indeed numbered, as with all the legendary rock venues, it would seem. In March of 2022, plans were announced that, yep, you guessed it, the building and the block containing it is slated to be demolished to make room for yet another gaudy gentrified condo building beginning construction next year. This one even has an artificial hillside in place of the history, mystery, and myth that have occupied the hallowed ground of 8852 West Sunset Boulevard since the early 1920s. Friends, we all have regrets. Anyone who says they don't is telling some kind of lies to someone, maybe themselves. We have all done or said something we wish we hadn't, and sometimes had to suffer very real consequences for it. In some cases, it may have meant spoiling a golden opportunity, or maybe souring a meaningful relationship or friendship. And indeed, in some cases, it's been a matter of life and death. Some people just have this magic ability to drink as much as they want or get high and stop when it's enough with little or no consequence. And some just can't stop no matter how dire the consequence. There's no formula to solve and no reasoning to work it out. It's just how it is. It's the field we play the game on. And if you feel like something that was once fun, like grabbing a few drinks or doing a line with some friends to keep the party going, has consistently rained upon you the showers of regret and consequence, it may be time to at least think about exploring some options for help. But the only one who can make that call is yourself. And if you want to set that ball rolling, you can call the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Hotline at 800-662-4753. You don't have to worry about the big picture right now, just do what you can for today. And with that, it's time to step out into the harsh daylight from our wild times at the Viper Room. Eventually, I hope to check back in on Johnny Depp, too. As I'm recording this, the Virginia defamation trial is in full swing, and it's brought up a wealth of topics of interest to me and the show, and I hope to one day explore it with all of you when all is said and done and the dust settles. My sources for the day were the Vice Dark Side of the 90s Viper Room episode, as well as about 1,051 or 2 internet articles, including stories on Ranker and The Mirror. Friends, as always, it's great to have this time with you. We've been getting such great feedback and response from all over the world. I'm not about going all super crazy with the shoutouts, but I do want to give a nod to our Seattle and Pacific Northwest listeners, as well as our Tucson crew and our growing following in Australia. And furthermore, to all of you who take the time to check out my stories of fame and infamy. As you know, these stories are meant for our entertainment and thoughtful humanizing observations, and dramatic license is employed lightly as the glue. But I'm honored, humbled, and blown away by each and every single one of you who take the time, and I thank you always for listening. We'll be back in 2 weeks, but in the meantime, remember what Poe said, believe none of what you hear, and only half of what you see.